Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Cole. I am a human rights lawyer and researcher with Pepperdine University's program on global faith and inclusive societies in Washington, D.C., where I focus on our Latin America portfolio and engagement with the Organization of American States. Our program focuses specifically on engaging governments and civil society around the world in international religious freedom advocacy. This morning, we will hear from three distinguished religious freedom advocates from the Americas, who I will introduce shortly. Following that, the director of our program, Knox Thames, will give some brief opening remarks, followed by our panelists. After that, we will have a time of Q&A where you will be welcome to ask questions of our panelists through the chat or by unmuting yourself. So to begin, I will introduce our panelists, and they can turn on their cameras. Our first panelist this morning is Teresa Flores. Teresa is a Peruvian lawyer. She has given lectures on issues related to hostilities against the right to religious freedom in different academic and political forums in Cuba, Colombia, Honduras, Mexico, and Peru, with publications about those topics. She is currently working as director of the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America, OLIRE, a research, training, and advocacy program whose mission is to promote religious freedom and highlight the restrictions on this right throughout the region. Her recent article, Regulation of FORB Rights by Organized Crime in Mexico, a real, although largely overlooked issue, is published on Canopy Forum, and OLIRE's 2024 annual report, which presents a general picture of the challenges and difficulties faced by religious communities in the region, based mainly on data obtained through their monitoring work, and their violent incidents database tool is now available on their website. Our next panelist will be Father Sergio Omar Sotelo Aguilar. Father Sotelo was ordained in the Congregation of Society of St. Paul in 1996 and has since been working with the Primate Archdiocese in Mexico. He holds a BA in Communications from el Instituto de Comunicación y Filosofía. Father Sotelo is currently the director of the news service of the Archdiocese called Catholic's Multimedia Center, which is also producing several short films and documentaries based on investigative reporting. They can be found on YouTube. In this capacity, Father Sotelo shares information with organizations publishing reports on religious freedom, including aid to the Church in Need and the U.S. State Department. Father Sotelo served as the executive secretary of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Mexico Commission for Pastoral and Social Communications and participates regularly in the periodical conferences hosted by the Pontifical Council for Social Communications in Rome, Italy. In 2017, he received awards such as the National Journalism Award, as well as the acknowledgement of the body of Latin American TV producers, CIPCA TV, for his research and investigative reports on the violence suffered by priests and religious workers in Mexico. And our final panelist will be Annalie Stengel. Annalie is CSW's Joint Director of Advocacy and also sits on the senior leadership team. She joined CSW in 1999 as a European Union liaison officer, advising members of the European Parliament, civil servants in the European Commission, External Action Service, and the Council of Ministers on freedom of religion or belief issues around the world. Under her leadership, the work of the CSW EU office in Brussels played a key role in the adoption of the EU guidelines on freedom of religion or belief. Early in her time at CSW, she also took over the Latin America research and advocacy portfolio, developing CSW's work over the next decade in Peru, Cuba, Colombia, and Mexico. In 2012, she relocated from Belgium to Washington, D.C., alongside her position as Joint Director of Advocacy. She continues to directly manage the Americas team, working on countries above in Nicaragua, Chile, and Venezuela. She holds a Bachelor's of Art in International Relations from Randolph-Macon Women's College and a Master's of Art in Conflict Resolution from Lancaster University in the UK. So now I will turn it over to the director of our program, Knox Thames, for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to everyone for joining this morning. We want to talk about new forms of religious freedom limitations in the Americas, because they come from both state and non-state actors. The persecution that most people think of when they think of it in our hemisphere comes from situations like in Nicaragua, which has become increasingly autocratic over the past 8 years. And the religious freedom violations have expanded with the Ortega regime's consolidation of power. We've seen the Ortega regime intimidate and arrest Christians to silence them and other activists, closing thousands of institutions and churches to push leading voices out of the country. In the same way, if you think about religious freedom violations in the Americas, Cuba comes to mind, because under the decades of oppression there, the legal framework of the communist government restricts the rights of citizens to religious freedom and allows for the harassment of religious leaders. So it makes sense that religious freedom advocates in the Americas have generally focused on these two nations, and for good reason. However, violence that stems from criminal activity, though sometimes indirect, also hinders freedom of religion or belief. Organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean is thus an emerging new threat as it constantly evolves and creates complex, unstable environments through various parts of the region. And it's an overlooked but growing concern for religious freedom, and that's why we wanted to talk about it today. The violence and displacement faced by various religious communities across the region is well publicized. We know about the illegal arms trade, drugs and human trafficking, gang influence and cartels that stretches across the region, working to directly put their impunity of misrule over entire communities. However, the topic of organized crime is not often associated with issues of religious persecution or the specific harms to communities and their leaders. So today's conversation will focus on this issue of transnational organized crime, where violence reaches across national boundaries and impacts religious freedom throughout the region. We see in some countries how gangs operate with impunity, and yet this comes in contrast with how the Western Hemisphere has generally been positive, had a strong track record on religious freedom, especially when compared to other parts of the world. The countries of the Americas, both North and South, generally respect religious freedom, not perfectly, but generally have a commitment to religious freedom for everyone. In the same way, the Organization of American States has established religious freedom as a foundational right, with the American Convention's phrase of, quote, freedom of conscience and religion, end quote, connecting faith and free thought. OAS standards support and reinforce UN standards on freedom of religion or belief, and in fact, even go beyond UN standards. For example, the explicit recognition of freedom of association for religious purposes found in Article 22 of the American Declaration and Article 16 of the American Convention. And that reflects the reality of how religious freedom is a bundled right, bundled in a way that makes it unique. As to be fully respected, other rights must also be respected and protected. Just think about the rights that you enjoy or rely upon when going to church, mosque, synagogue, or temple. Of course, there's freedom of belief and freedom of worship, but there's also the right of freedom of association. There's freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, parental rights, also issues of legal recognition and property rights. So for these reasons, we like to say that religious freedom is the canary in the coal mine for the overall health of a human rights environment. And as we look closer in many of the countries in our hemisphere, we see the canary beginning to struggle due to the impact of organized crime. Now, of course, organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean affects all communities, but the transnational nature makes it an international concern. Indeed, as of December 2023, half of the reported homicides in the region were attributed or connected to organized crime. According to a 2023 UN study, Latin America contains the world's highest homicide rate, with 40 of the top 50 most murderous cities in our hemisphere. And so in this context, religious leaders and communities are also targets. They are obstacles to gang control over communities. Worshippers cannot gather. Places of worship no longer feel safe. So to highlight this overlooked but emerging issue, our expert panel will discuss these trends across the region, but also specifically Mexico and Colombia. Religious leaders, because they're seen as peacemakers, are increasingly targets of illegal armed and criminal groups due to their positive influence in the community with youth, encouraging young people and the unemployed to reject gang participation or criminal activities. In the same way, places of worship are nodes of influence that promote positive value, yet they also can threaten illegal activity and are regularly attacked. As we'll hear, violence has reached extreme levels in Mexico. In just the last 6 years, 10 priests have been murdered, another 14 priests and bishops attacked, with a weekly average of 26 churches desecrated or assaulted. We'll also hear how insecurity in Colombia impacts religious freedom. The territorial expansion from criminal organizations and armed groups render religious communities and their leaders incredibly vulnerable. These non-state actors threaten priests and pastors while seeking churches or religious buildings to store weapons or drugs, which puts the lives of pastors and laity at risk. And demonstrating the dynamism of the region, new religious groups are also moving in, competing with traditional Catholicism, while secularism also increases. Such changing dynamics are visible in Mexico and Colombia. In fact, the Pew Research Center just yesterday released a report about changes of faith affiliation, finding that 16% of adults in Mexico and 18% in Colombia report having left the Christian faith altogether. So the region is dynamic in so many ways. So I appreciate our panelists joining us today to help shine a light on these new challenges to people of faith, to religious freedom, to broaden our understanding of this emerging challenge. For an issue this complex, we need a comprehensive approach that partners with religious freedom advocates from the region. We need to hear their perspectives as they understand the multifaceted and interconnected nature of freedom of religion or belief and organized crime. And I think that based on their advice, we can begin to develop strategies to respond as a community of values, learning from them about how best to take action against this daunting challenge. And it is a challenge, it's a huge challenge. And I want to end my remarks by quoting Pope Francis's most recent catechesis, which he issued on Wednesday. While my background is Baptist, I really appreciated his words of encouragement as we talk about this pernicious and multi-component problem. He said, quote, "Dear brothers and sisters, let us not lose hope. Even if our history appears burdensome, complicated, perhaps even ruin to us, we always have the possibility of consigning it to God and setting out anew on our journey. God is merciful and awaits us always." So with that, I look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Emily, for your work in setting this up. And I think the discussion will be very positive and fruitful.
Okay, with that, we'll turn it over to our first panelist, who is Teresa Flores. She will give an overview of the situation in Latin America, and from there, we'll pass it on to Pastor Sotelo. Okay, Teresa.
Bien, gracias. Buenos días a todos. Agradezco mucho al director del programa, Dr. Thames, por la invitación, así como al padre Omar Sotelo, a Ana Lee por su participación y por el compromiso, ¿no? con el esfuerzo de abordar este tema, la relación entre el crimen organizado y persecución religiosa en América Latina. Y me gustaría empezar imaginándonos un escenario, ¿no? Imaginemos a un líder religioso que denuncia la violencia, que denuncia lazos de corrupción en su comunidad y días o semanas después es asesinado, ¿no? O otro líder religioso que intenta mediar entre bandas criminales y es secuestrado. Uno podría pensar que se trata de situaciones o de historias aisladas, pero en realidad esto se ha convertido en una tendencia algo alarmante en la región, ¿no? Ya el doctor Thames lanzó algunos datos y existen diversos estudios sobre crimen organizado que indican cómo el crimen organizado en América Latina tiene uno de los más altos índices de criminalidad, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, la región tiene una tasa de homicidios que es 3 veces superior al promedio mundial. Y de estos homicidios, el 50% del total está asociado al crimen organizado. Sabemos que las consecuencias de este fenómeno son, por supuesto, devastadoras, afectan la seguridad, la estabilidad social, el desarrollo en todos los niveles sociales, económicos, culturales, etc. Ahora, frente a esto, usualmente los gobiernos adoptan diversas estrategias de seguridad, pero usualmente pasan por alto a un sector que es particularmente vulnerable, ¿no? Que son los líderes y comunidades religiosas. Y mi intención con la presentación que voy a hacer hoy es explicar por qué esto es un problema de libertad religiosa y cómo el crimen organizado restringe estos espacios de fe. Usualmente, al menos desde la experiencia del observatorio, cuando abordamos este tema, una pregunta frecuente es, ¿qué tiene que ver el crimen organizado con la forma en que una persona ejerce su libertad religiosa? Y para responder esto es clave recordar que la libertad religiosa es un derecho multidimensional que está reconocido en tratados internacionales, ya mencionaron algunos, ¿no? El Pacto Internacional de Derechos Civiles y Políticos, la Convención Americana sobre Derechos Humanos, por ejemplo. Y a nivel individual, este derecho implica la libertad de creer, de no creer, cambiar de creencias incluso, ¿no? También implica el derecho a practicar, a manifestar y expresar esas creencias, ya sea en público o en privado. Pero también hay una dimensión comunitaria, ¿no? Es decir, se protege la organización de las iglesias, la educación religiosa, la difusión de la fe y incluso el acceso a los lugares de culto. Entonces, el problema surge cuando la violencia, cuando el crimen organizado limita, impide estas libertades. En la región se han documentado numerosos casos de asesinatos, secuestros, amenazas de muerte, ataques a templos y propiedades, incluso el desplazamiento forzado de líderes de comunidades religiosas, ¿no? Y si bien México y Colombia registran las cifras más altas, este fenómeno no es exclusivo de estos países. Solo entre 2022 y 2024, la base de datos de incidentes violentos de OLIRE registró el asesinato de alrededor de 15 líderes religiosos, laicos o congregantes en Venezuela, 54 en México, 25 en Honduras y 31 en Colombia. Y también se documentaron otras formas de violencia, como por ejemplo amenazas de muerte, ataques a la integridad física con 47 casos en Venezuela, 315 en México, más de 100 en Honduras y 199 alrededor en Colombia. Entonces, nosotros somos conscientes también de que estos números pueden representar solo una parte del problema, ¿verdad? Porque en muchos países de la región no existen canales de denuncia adecuados o existe el temor a las represalias y por ello es que las víctimas no reportan estos hechos. Y ahora, estos hallazgos, ¿no? o lo que hay detrás de estos números, indican que los líderes religiosos con mayor presencia, con mayor influencia en sus comunidades, son los más vulnerables, ¿no? Y especialmente esto sucede cuando, como parte de su misión, por ejemplo, denuncian actividades criminales, denuncian redes de corrupción, defienden derechos humanos, derechos ambientales, derechos de los pueblos indígenas, cuando desafían el control criminal de su territorio, cuando incluso, esto ya se mencionó también al comienzo, cuando buscan alejar a los jóvenes, ¿no? Del reclutamiento de estos grupos. Y cuando asumen estos roles, entonces, los líderes religiosos desafían el status quo, se convierten en un obstáculo para las operaciones del crimen organizado. Y esto los vuelve blanco de represalias con un impacto directo en la fe. Y para entender esto también quiero mencionar rápidamente algunos escenarios que ilustran cómo estas distintas acciones del crimen organizado afectan la libertad religiosa. Y vamos a poner algunos ejemplos, ¿no? Cuando un líder religioso es asesinado, ¿no? Su muerte, además de ser evidentemente un atentado contra su vida, también genera un efecto de miedo, ¿no? Limita el ejercicio de la libertad religiosa de toda su comunidad. Si es forzado a pagar derecho de piso, por ejemplo, ¿no? Su comunidad religiosa sufre un impacto directo porque de alguna forma esto limita la capacidad que tienen para gestionar sus recursos, para mantener, ¿no? Sostener sus actividades de culto, y esto evidentemente afecta, por ejemplo, su autonomía financiera, su autonomía organizativa. Cuando los grupos criminales imponen toques de queda, ¿no? O controlan quién puede entrar, quién puede salir de un territorio, restringen el acceso a la práctica colectiva de la religión. Cuando un líder religioso, por ejemplo, es obligado a abandonar su comunidad, ya sea por amenazas de muerte, ¿no? Por ejemplo. En este caso, no solo se priva al líder religioso de su hogar, sino también de su derecho a congregarse, su derecho a liderar su comunidad de fe. Y esto debilita el ejercicio colectivo de la libertad religiosa. Lo mismo sucede cuando comunidades enteras son obligadas a huir por amenazas del crimen organizado. En estos casos es muy común que pierdan sus lazos religiosos, sus lazos culturales. Y esto no solo afecta su identidad, sino que también les impide congregarse y practicar su fe. Esta situación afecta de manera muy particular a las comunidades indígenas, ¿no? Que se ven obligadas a huir a raíz de la violencia. Entonces, estos son los escenarios en los que nosotros tenemos que entender que existe una real afectación como consecuencia de la violencia, de la inseguridad. Entre otros cuestionamientos que se hacen, ¿no? Algunas veces hemos escuchado que se ha alegado, por ejemplo, esto no es persecución religiosa, los criminales no atacan necesariamente por motivos religiosos, ¿no? Esto es una de las cosas que se plantea. Pero aquí creemos que lo importante o que la clave no es tanto la intención del agresor, sino el impacto de sus acciones. La violencia y el crimen organizado en la práctica restringe la expresión, la organización de la fe. Esto limita el ejercicio pleno de la libertad religiosa y por eso no siempre es necesario exigir una justificación antirreligiosa, ¿no? Como para configurarlo como una amenaza. Y esta atención de líderes religiosos, ¿no? Como población vulnerable tampoco es que sea tan nueva, ¿no? El riesgo que enfrentan los líderes religiosos ya ha sido reconocido por organismos de derechos humanos. Por ejemplo, en el caso mexicano, la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos ha emitido ya medidas cautelares para sacerdotes y para pastores en México. Y de igual manera hay distintas relatorías de las Naciones Unidas que han expresado preocupación por la seguridad de los líderes religiosos. Y en el caso colombiano, por ejemplo, la Defensoría del Pueblo del país ha reconocido la necesidad de prestar especial atención a los líderes religiosos, ¿no? que por la naturaleza de su vocación son amenazados, para que sean incorporados, o bueno, reincorporados en programas de prevención y en programas de protección de derechos humanos. Entonces, y esto ya lo digo a modo de conclusión, eh, creemos desde el observatorio, y creo que aquí todos compartimos esta intención, es muy importante entender que el crimen organizado no solo es un problema de seguridad, también es una amenaza directa a la libertad religiosa. Y si bien los datos disponibles reflejan un panorama que es bastante alarmante, creemos que el subregistro sigue siendo significativo, ¿no? Ya sea por desconocimiento de la problemática o lo que les decía, la falta de canales de denuncia, el temor. Y esto resalta la necesidad de ampliar estos esfuerzos de documentación, ampliar los esfuerzos de investigación y desde el observatorio siempre enfatizamos que esta problemática tiene que abordarse de manera colectiva, ¿no? Y es por esto que se tienen que involucrar organizaciones de la sociedad civil, instituciones académicas, funcionarios públicos, porque todo esfuerzo suma para visibilizar esta problemática y para contribuir a una respuesta más efectiva. Bueno, y con esto y con este contexto general, ya doy pase a los siguientes panelistas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Teresa. Next up, Father Sotelo.
Ya estamos. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Saludos a todos, gracias por la invitación. Saludos y bendiciones a todos los panelistas. Y bueno, yo creo que quiero iniciar diciendo que la problemática que vivimos frente a esta incidencia de violencia contra sacerdotes, religiosos, instalaciones de la iglesia en el mundo, contra la libertad religiosa, es algo que de alguna otra manera pues ha estado creciendo a nivel nacional e internacional. Por desgracia, México es uno de los primeros países en donde ejercer el ministerio sacerdotal es peligrosísimo, ¿sí? En los últimos 15 años podemos decir que México, ¿sí?, está dentro de los primeros países en donde esta situación no solo se ha detenido, sino que ha ido creciendo, sino que ha ido avanzando, se ha agudizado de una manera tremenda, de una manera sustancial. Tan solo la semana pasada, en nuestro país, 8 jóvenes en Irapuato, Guanajuato, después de terminar su trabajo en la parroquia como miembros de un grupo parroquial, fueron asesinados por miembros de un cártel organizado allá en Guanajuato. Fueron baleados, 8 de ellos padecieron, jóvenes menores de edad, jóvenes pertenecientes a un grupo pastoral de una de las parroquias allá en Irapuato, en Guerrero. Tenemos ahorita también la nota de que tenemos un sacerdote que se llama Francisco, lo estamos tratando de corroborar, que lleva casi un mes desaparecido, estamos corroborando el dato. Si lamentablemente esto se confirma, se uniría a otros 2 sacerdotes que por más de 10 años han desaparecido, el padre, Santiago, de allá de Zamora, Michoacán, y el padre Carlos Ornelas de Ciudad Victoria, Tamaulipas. Esto se une, pues, lamentablemente, a esta ola de tragedia en México. Tenemos un cardenal asesinado, 59 sacerdotes asesinados, un diácono, 4 religiosos, 100 laicos, lo que da más de 100 casos en México en los últimos años, en donde esta tragedia, pues, ha causado una situación muy violenta, muy de inseguridad, como bien decía Tere, como ha añadido a los datos, como decía el doctor, una situación tremenda en donde la religión, la libertad religiosa, pues obviamente se ve presa de estas situaciones. México en estos días ha convulsionado con la aparición de estos centros que les han llamado centros de exterminio, aunque el gobierno pues ha tratado de minimizar el asunto diciendo que estos no son centros de exterminio, y podemos decir que son centros de exterminio. ¿Por qué? Porque se extermina la libertad, se termina la voluntad de hombres y mujeres que, presas del narcotráfico y del crimen organizado, lamentablemente encuentran la muerte en estos sitios. Y yo les voy a decir, y como lo he dicho en otras conferencias, por desgracia, en México va a seguir corriendo sangre, porque el crimen organizado que ha penetrado instituciones gubernamentales, que ha infiltrado instituciones de alto nivel en el gobierno, en el ejército, en la marina y en otras instituciones, pues obviamente ha corrompido de una manera brutal la seguridad de nuestro país. Y esto, pues, se ve claramente, en el impacto a la Iglesia católica y a sus miembros. ¿Y por qué esto es importante decirlo? Ciertamente en México, sí podemos decir que no es una, persecución religiosa como tal en México, como fue en 1929 en la época de la cristiada mexicana. Eh, en México hoy es un hostigamiento que incluso podemos decir que es mucho más peligrosa que aquella del 29. ¿Por qué? Porque hoy el crimen organizado atenta en contra de la figura sacerdotal, porque esta es un estabilizador social. La figura sacerdotal estabiliza la comunidad, estabiliza la parroquia. Sí, la parroquia no solo presta servicios, servicios espirituales, servicios en la administración, de los sacramentos, sino que también ofrece servicios de protección a derechos humanos, protección a mujeres, a indígenas, a migrantes, protección a niños, da servicios de educación, medicina, educativos y de otros. Bolsas de trabajo, inclusive en algunos lugares, ¿no? Y esto, obviamente, para muchas organizaciones del crimen organizado es una especie de competencia, que cuando ellos se ven afectados por esta situación, entonces, pues obviamente ven minimizados sus intereses y su poder. Por eso, cuando asesinan a un sacerdote, y esto es, yo creo que lo importante de la investigación que nosotros hemos realizado en el Centro Católico Multimedial, es que al asesinar a un sacerdote no se asesina solo a una persona, se asesina a todo un organismo, se deja en la orfandad a un organismo, a una institución, y entonces, una vez eliminado a esta persona, se desestabiliza la comunidad. Y al desestabilizar la comunidad, al dejarla en la orfandad, el crimen organizado logra uno de sus primeros objetivos. ¿Cuál es? Primero, enquistar el silencio y el temor en aquellas comunidades. Nos quieren callados, nos quieren silenciados para no poder hablar. No, en balde, México es uno de los primeros países en donde también han asesinado más periodistas, ¿no? Es una situación tremenda, o sea, hombres y mujeres que hablan, que son líderes de opinión, son acallados. El crimen organizado nos quiere acallar. Y una vez que tiene acallada a la comunidad, silenciada a la comunidad, una vez que ha sembrado el terror, el temor, ellos logran crear, ¿verdad? Un ambiente tremendamente corrupto en aquella zona, ¿verdad? Y entonces crece el narcogobierno, la narcopolítica, la narcoeconomía. Esto es brutal, es brutal. ¿Por qué? Porque ha hecho de muchísimos pueblos en México, debemos decirlo de esta forma, no todo México está sufriendo este flagelo, pero sí, muchísimos lugares en el territorio mexicano están padeciendo esta violencia y entonces ha habido dentro de estos territorios y de estos lugares incluso migraciones internas de gente que ya no ha podido sobrevivir porque el crimen organizado principal prácticamente ha tomado, ¿verdad?, presa a esa comunidad. Entonces, esta violencia es verdaderamente perversa. Tuve la oportunidad de participar en la Cumbre Internacional de Libertad Religiosa allá en Washington hace unos días, hace unos meses, y platicando con algunos congresistas y algunos embajadores de América Latina, que me decían, bueno, bueno, ese problema pues es un problema local, que nosotros qué tenemos que ver con esta situación. Y a esta reflexión interesante que me hicieron favor los embajadores de América Latina, que tuvimos la reunión allá en la Anunciatura Apostólica en Washington y con algunos congresistas, esta reflexión me llevó también a tener como conclusión lo siguiente. Ciertamente el problema que parecería local, que parecería un problema de nuestros pueblos, tiene una incidencia, tiene un efecto global, tiene un efecto global. Lo que pasa localmente en nuestros países, el efecto es global. Y se los demostré de esta manera, ¿verdad? Eh, en Estados Unidos y en otros países de primer mundo, los jóvenes están sufriendo por la inundación de diferente tipo de drogas que han hecho presa a muchísimos jóvenes, que prácticamente los han esclavizado a la drogadicción. Y está destruyendo vidas de manera interminable. En México, nuestros jóvenes son reclutados por el crimen organizado. Lo que se ha descubierto en este lamentable rancho allá en Jalisco, ¿verdad? Es producto de un centro de reclutamiento de muchísimos jóvenes que son preparados para ser sicarios. Yo he conocido jóvenes que han sido lamentablemente reclutados al crimen organizado y los deshumanizan por completo para cometer los actos que cometen. Obviamente, cuando estos actos se llevan a cabo, tanto los jóvenes nuestros en América Latina como los jóvenes en otros lugares como Estados Unidos, están sufriendo estas penalidades. Y quienes están tratando de luchar para cambiar esta mentalidad son muchísimos sacerdotes y ministros de la iglesia, pastores inclusive de otras religiones, que han tratado de cambiar la mentalidad, son silenciados por estos hombres y mujeres del crimen organizado. ¿Por qué? Porque ven que al cambiar las mentalidades y los corazones de los jóvenes, les quitan a ellos la materia prima con las cuales ellos trabajan, el corazón de muchísimos jóvenes. Por eso les digo, el problema que parece ser local tiene efectos globales y de manera tremenda que arrasan con la libertad y con la vida de muchísimos hombres y mujeres en el mundo. Así que, pues, México, pues, está sufriendo este flagelo que parecería interminable. Somos profetas de esperanza, también tenemos que decirlo, ¿eh? Tenemos que hablar siempre con un profetismo que salva, que redime, que santifica, que dignifica. Y pese a esta situación que parecería no tener fin, nosotros como hombres y mujeres de fe tenemos que seguir luchando. De mi parte, como sacerdote, como periodista, pues he tenido la gran oportunidad de hablar y de visibilizar este problema. No podemos callarlo. Como dije, el crimen organizado quiere callarnos a como dé lugar. Pero yo creo que mientras haya una sola voz que hable a favor de la vida, en contra de estos crímenes organizados que nos esclavizan, entonces creo que hay esperanza de poder superar este tipo de flagelos.
Thank you, Father, for your words. Our final panelist will be Annalise Stengel.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. As I begin, it is very important to clarify that the situations and cases that I'll be talking about today will not be the experience of many religious leaders and groups in Colombia who live in relatively secure urban areas and have little to no interaction with illegal armed and criminal groups. On the other hand, civil society leaders, including religious leaders, living and working in areas where illegal armed and criminal groups are present, operate in a very different and dangerous context. Over the past decade, hundreds of civil society leaders, including environmental activists and community leaders, have been assassinated. Illegal armed and criminal groups, especially in Colombia, can be compared in some ways to authoritarian regimes in the way they approach civil rights, including freedom of religion or belief, in areas under their control or influence. In Colombia, we see a very complex conflict with multiple and shifting actors over decades. Far-left militant groups, including the National Liberation Army, or ELN, and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, emerged in the 1960s, and a few decades later were countered not only by government forces, but also by far-right and ultra-violent paramilitary groups. Questionable demobilization deals with paramilitaries in the 2000s and an unevenly implemented peace agreement with the FARC in 2016 did not bring an end to the conflict. On the contrary, factions within both the paramilitaries and the FARC broke away to form new groups, while some of those who were disappointed by the demobilization and peace processes returned to participation in violent groups. Many of the present-day organized criminal groups have roots in or can be linked to the historic leftist groups as well as the paramilitaries, and tend to employ similar tactics in establishing their influence or control. Waves of violence have grown more intense in recent months, with the withdrawal of the ELN from peace talks, and clashes between the ELN and FARC dissident groups, leading to mass displacements and reports of atrocities. Leftist groups have traditionally had an ideological problem with religion, and Christianity in particular. The ELN and the FARC have historically imposed restrictions and in some cases moratoriums on freedom of religion or belief in territories under their control. They are probably responsible together for the forced displacement and assassination of thousands of religious leaders since they became established 60 years ago. Today, all of the groups, separate from any political ideology, left, right, and criminal, tend to operate on the basis of control in areas under their de facto authority, and they seek to establish such control over civilian populations in disputed territories. This control extends to thought, expression, association, conscience, assembly, and movement. Illegal armed groups routinely monitor and carry out surveillance, openly and covertly, on religious groups in areas under their influence or control, to keep track of who is attending, participating, and what is the content of the preaching or messaging. They are watching the movement of religious leaders. Who are they visiting? Who do they have influence over? This is part of a more general concern about people who hold influence. By their nature, part of a religious leader's job is to influence those they lead. They often hold some degree of respect in their wider community. What they say holds weight. People seek them out for guidance and advice, or to confess wrongdoing. Religious leaders literally have a pulpit. They convene and speak publicly to groups of people in the community on a regular basis. If what a religious leader is saying, preaching, or advising is not, at the least, neutral in reference to what an illegal armed or criminal group may be doing, or worse, is perceived as detrimental to them or their activities, they are likely to be labeled as an enemy. A particular flashpoint mentioned by Father Sotelo already is around the recruitment of young people. These illegal armed and criminal groups are in constant need of new bodies, literally. In January, we were told by Protestant pastors in an area of the country with a heavy presence of illegal armed and criminal groups that they had been told they would be allowed to tithe their young people, referencing the religious practice of giving a certain percentage of income to a church. In this case, pastors were offered the opportunity to turn over 10% of their young people to the armed group in return for having the rest of their youth left alone. A horrific decision to be given. Illegal armed and criminal groups regularly extort funds from churches as well, obligating church leaders to turn over a set percentage of their income to the groups. I'll never forget speaking to a pastor in southern Colombia who told me about an elderly woman in his congregation who sold flowers on the street to make a living, and how he had agonized over the demand to give a percentage of what she and others donated to an armed group that would, without a doubt, use the money to pursue, in his words, a culture of death. He ultimately refused to do so, was designated a military target by the armed group, and was forced into hiding. In a sense, he was lucky. Illegal armed and criminal groups sometimes go beyond attempts to extort money or youth and demand active cooperation. In January of this year, a pastoral couple living and working in an extremely rural part of northern Colombia attended an evening prayer service at a sister church. The wife left the service a little early to accompany a pregnant woman home. Her husband stayed to the end of the service and began the walk back to their village with his 3 stepchildren, ages 14, 13, and 8, and other members of the church. As they walked in the darkness, 2 young men wearing surgical masks and on a motorcycle pulled up behind them. The young men indicated that they were there for the pastor. A woman with the group stepped in front of him to protect him and was shot in the arm. His 13-year-old stepdaughter screamed at him to run, but he probably knew he would not get very far. Instead, he raised his arms in prayer and was shot in the heart and then in the head. His wife arrived home to an empty and dark house. Sometime later, a neighbor came to tell her husband had been wounded. She went to the location where she found him, not wounded, but dead. She called the police, who, out of fear or corruption or possibly both, refused to come. She stayed with his body for hours before another neighbor was brave enough to come out and help her carry his body to the clinic, where he was declared dead. As is very often the case, it was not clear at first why the pastor had been targeted. But as his wife was looking through his mobile phone, she found recordings he had made of conversations with members of an illegal armed group. In the recordings, she heard him refuse their demands to allow them to use the church as a safe location to store weapons and drugs. She turned a copy of the recording over to the local prosecutor, and the next day got a phone call warning her that she and her family should leave immediately because what she had done had gotten back to the illegal armed group, and she was next. The murder of this pastor and the subsequent forced displacement of his wife and children is an example of how violations of freedom of religion or belief can manifest in areas under the control or influence of illegal armed or criminal groups. But it does not stop there. The church they led is essentially shut down, leaving those who attended without a place of worship. In addition, other religious leaders in this area will obviously be acutely aware of what had happened. This murder is not just an act of retaliation against a religious leader who refused to acquiesce to the demands of an illegal armed group, but a clear message to all other religious leaders in the area as to the consequences of not following their orders. This will have a chilling effect on freedom of religion or belief in that area. This case also illustrates the huge challenges around documenting and monitoring freedom of religion or belief in areas under the control or influence of illegal armed groups. In this case, there was fairly concrete evidence in the form of a recording showing why the pastor was targeted and the link to his role as a religious leader. However, in many, if not most cases, such evidence does not exist. This often allows authorities, who for varied reasons may not be enthusiastic about carrying out a vigorous investigation, to put them down to indiscriminate criminal activity, wrong place, wrong time, or even to attribute potential fault to the victim. We see something similar in Mexico. It should also be noted that in locations where illegal armed and criminal groups operate, there is often a degree of permeation of local and regional governments. This may make those who receive the threats reluctant to report them, not knowing who they can trust, even within the security forces. The pastor who turned over the recording to the prosecutor's office experienced this firsthand. It can also be difficult for groups like ours, who want to monitor and document the situation, to do so, even if we are able to earn the trust of those affected. As mentioned earlier, illegal armed and criminal groups often closely monitor the movement of people in and out of areas under their control, and will take special note of outsiders making visits. Communication is often insecure. Those who live in these areas understand the potentially high cost of sharing what is happening with the authorities or with human rights organizations, and the climate of fear is intense. In late December, in another city which is a known transit zone for multiple illegal armed and criminal groups moving narcotics and weapons, A pastor, his wife, and 2 young adult children were gunned down as they ate lunch following a church service in what was clearly a targeted assassination. It is still not known if the pastor, who in addition to leading a local church, also oversaw 35 urban and rural churches across the region, traveling frequently to support these congregations, had received threats. But we saw how rumors immediately spread. There were news reports that the murdered pastor had a fleet of luxury trucks and owned large swathes of land, all untrue. The official story now is that it was a case of mistaken identity. A woman with short blonde hair, nicknamed the Devil, was confused by hitmen who were following her with the daughter of the pastor, who had long dark hair. And they killed the thin 43-year-old pastor in his Sunday suit first because he looked like a bodyguard to them. It is hard to know what is true. But what we do know is on the day of the murder and in the following days, at least 30 other Protestant pastors in the same city received death threats or were warned to leave, either in person or over the phone, by people they did not know, leading some to flee the area. We also know that in 2023, the Colombian government took the inexplicable decision to remove religious leaders from a list of categories of vulnerable people with access to security mechanisms should they come under threat. In a context like that of Colombia's, this is like giving a green light to illegal armed and criminal groups, that religious leaders are fair game. Given the increasingly insecure situation in many parts of the country and a possible return to levels of violence last seen a decade ago, it is imperative that religious leaders be restored to that list immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Annalee. Now we'll open up the floor to some questions. I see we received one in the chat. You are free to write your question there in the chat, or you can use the raise hand tool and unmute yourself. So the first question posed to the group is from Pastor Mario Felix Llenar Barroso. He is a Baptist pastor in the US, originally from Cuba, where he had to flee. His question is regarding law. He is asking about a law that the Cuban government enacted a law on worship or religious freedom. If they enacted this, if it would actually improve the situation or make it worse. He states that in his experience, it would be like putting a new patch on old clothes, to quote scripture, or new wine into old wineskins. So the question then is, have you seen this in your experiences in your organizations where governments enact laws that look like they are trying to better the situation or allow for freedom of religion or belief, but in reality that actually makes the situation worse for religious communities and leaders?
Emily, creo que podría hacer un comentario breve nada más sobre esto. Muchas gracias, Pastor Mario. Qué bueno saber de usted. Yo creo que en el contexto de la pregunta es importante resaltar algo en conexión con el tema de que es crimen organizado y libertad religiosa. Y es que es totalmente cierto que en los regímenes autoritarios las leyes se utilizan más para legitimar el control y no tanto para garantizar derechos. Entonces, que haya una ley en general de libertad religiosa no garantiza de por sí esto, ¿no? La protección de este derecho. Ahora, en el caso de América Latina, hemos visto cómo hay contextos de crimen organizado en el que tanto actores estatales como no estatales pueden restringir la libertad religiosa. Y en Cuba, como usted menciona, sabemos que es el propio gobierno el que administra muchas de estas dinámicas, ¿no? Y por eso en el análisis, en todo caso, de la conexión entre libertad religiosa y crimen organizado, un aspecto que es sin duda importante es que no siempre se trata de actores criminales que actúan fuera del Estado, sino que son estructuras de poder que cooptan instituciones y que regulan o aprueban normas en su propio beneficio, ¿no? Entonces, esto sí es importante resaltar. En el escenario del crimen organizado son tanto actores estatales, en confabulación también con actores no estatales.
Annalee, go ahead.
I can also answer that. I think briefly, and this would apply to authoritarian governments as well as to illegal armed and criminal groups or those contexts, that a law is only as good as it is enforced. And so you can have great laws on the books, and if an authoritarian government chooses to misinterpret them or wrongly apply them or ignore them, they don't really matter. In a country like Colombia and Mexico, you have very good laws around religious freedom, but you also have very, very high levels of impunity. And so as long as crimes are not investigated, as long as attacks on church leaders are not pursued, the situation will continue, and the laws aren't particularly relevant to that situation.
Father Sotelo? If you can unmute yourself.
El audio. Ok, completamente de acuerdo con lo que dice Ana y con lo que dice Tere. Yo creo que la libertad religiosa en países de América Latina muchas veces no tiene que estar sustentada solo en la práctica de una ley. En México, por ejemplo, aparentemente hay una libertad de culto, no así religiosa. Y aunque parecería que en la actualidad los gobiernos actuales tienen cierta afinidad con la libertad religiosa en México, no lo es tanto, siempre se pone una barrera. Por ejemplo, lo voy a decir de esta forma, el actual presidente en nuestro país jamás va a atentar en contra de la Iglesia Católica, jamás. Sin embargo, tampoco la va a promover, pero sí promoverá aquellas organizaciones que van en contra, ¿verdad?, de la Iglesia Católica, de sus actividades y de su ejercicio pastoral, limitando así muchísimo de su quehacer. A veces se le da más importancia a otro tipo de situaciones. Por ejemplo, en México, un sacerdote tiene menos derechos que otro tipo de personas. Un sacerdote es un ciudadano de segunda categoría, lo que limita muchísimo su acción y su libertad religiosa en el país.
Thank you. We have another question from Camila Sanchez Sandoval from Colombia. Her question is, what are some of the actions that could be taken to make evident to the whole society the type of persecution against religious leaders that you all have emphasized? She comments that in Colombia, Colombia has sort of set aside the relationship between organized crime and religious freedom. And so what could be done from the public policy side of things? Annalie?
I think the first thing, and I know Teresa and Father Sotelo are doing this daily, is documentation and getting good documentation of these cases, creating networks and safe ways for people to report what's happening to them and in their communities, whether that's confidentially or if it can be made public, to be made public. In the specific case of Colombia, I mentioned at the end that the government does maintain a list of categories of people who are vulnerable, who can receive access to safety mechanisms, security mechanisms, and pastors are no longer, or religious leaders are no longer on that. If they were on that and that existed, there would be a secondary mechanism to record all of those cases that are reported. It probably wouldn't be all of them, but it would be give them a start at least to measure what's happening and to be aware in what parts of the country, what types of violations, what types of threats are occurring. So for public policy, putting in place official monitoring bodies and ways of reporting would be important, alongside working with nonprofit organizations and NGOs and church groups.
Great. Knox?
Oops.
Well, when I hear what Father Sergio said and Teresa and Annalie's great work, as someone who is a former diplomat for the United States, there's opportunities to take this information to the international level for bilateral engagement. In the United States, we're in a period of transition. It's unclear how the Trump administration, the second term, will approach these issues. But as the United States has traditionally been willing to raise these types of issues with their counterparts in the foreign ministry and the Ministry of Interior. There's also the international network. The UN Special Rapporteur has a sort of an emergency response program where information can be sent to her via email and request her to make an intervention with a foreign official, as well as through the OAS and with the commission and the court. So I offer that as an opportunity to take this information in very concrete ways, the who, what, where, when, and why, with a clear request for an outside group to raise concerns with a specific person about a specific incident. So I'd offer that as just a practice that we could start to pursue more. At the same time, I would have a question from that for the three other panelists. Considering so much of this is at the local level with these non-state actor groups, what kind of international pressure is helpful? What can see an alleviation of the persecution that these pastors and clergy are experiencing? So I asked my panelists that question.
Yeah,
Eh,
Father Sotelo.
ok.
Gracias por esta oportunidad. Creo que una de las cosas importantes que debemos de resaltar, y agradezco pues este ofrecimiento que el doctor nos da para seguir visibilizando. Yo creo que eso es lo más importante y también respondiendo a la pregunta de nuestros participantes, no podemos callar frente al crimen organizado. Como dije hace rato y como señalé hace rato, este tipo de organizaciones nos quieren mantener callados, nos quieren silenciar. Y lamentablemente, pues ha causado esto en algunas bajas. Hace unos meses, en Chiapas, uno de nuestros sacerdotes muy querido, un activista muy fuerte en protección de los derechos indígenas, padre Marcelo Pérez, que fue asesinado, ¿verdad? Que ya él tenía varias amenazas de muerte, pues fue acallado. Sin embargo, esto es un reclamo que porque su sangre va a clamar justicia, su sangre en vez de ser acallada va a seguir clamando justicia y una voz que quiera liberar. No podemos callarnos. Entonces, creo que visibilizar la situación es algo que no podemos hacer. Yo desde mi experiencia particular puedo decir, ¿verdad? Que nosotros llevamos más de 15 años hablando de esta situación. En un principio, incluso al interior de la misma iglesia, y eso tengo que decirlo, no con el afán de criticar ni mucho menos, pero a lo mejor por los temores y muchas circunstancias que se guardan en cuanto a las relaciones iglesia, Estado y demás, nos pedían guardar silencio frente a esta situación. Hubo gente al interior que me decía, tienes que callar, ¿verdad? Lo que tú estás diciendo no es verdad, lo que tú estás diciendo es amarillismo o es una cosa espectacular que no tiene fundamento en la realidad. Hoy, a 10 o 20, a 15 años después de eso, vemos que la realidad nos ha sobrepasado y que lamentablemente hoy México, como dije, es uno de los primeros países donde ser sacerdote es peligrosísimo. Por lo tanto, tenemos que seguir hablando. Nosotros desde el Centro Católico hemos tratado de seguir visibilizando la situación a tal grado de que organizaciones como Olire, como donde labora Ann, esta participación que tuvimos en la Cumbre de Libertad Religiosa en Washington, a nivel internacional, en el Vaticano, en otras instancias gubernamentales, hoy toman la información que nosotros en el Centro Católico Multimedial, pues hemos aportado a la opinión pública nacional e internacional. ¿Por qué lo cito? Porque es importante seguir visibilizando. Si no visibilizamos esta situación, obviamente esto va a quedar oculto y entonces va a seguir siendo una situación como una enfermedad, como una infección que bajo tierra, bajo la epidermis, va causando muchísimo más daño. Entonces, sí, hay inseguridad. Muchos de los que hemos hablado de esta situación hemos recibido amenazas, acoso, hemos recibido algunas situaciones nada agradables. Sin embargo, creo que es mayor el poder hablar y el poder expresar esta situación para tratar de erradicar este problema que nuestros pueblos en América Latina están sufriendo. Entonces, pues agradezco el ofrecimiento del doctor, agradezco la pregunta de nuestros participantes y espero que hayamos respondido.
Yo quisiera añadir algo rápidamente, y es que, claro, la visibilización es importante, el presionar a los estados, pero creo que también es importante ver a la comunidad religiosa en sí, no solo como víctima. Sí es una víctima, por supuesto, pero no solo es una víctima, ¿no? También es un actor clave para la resistencia pacífica. Sabemos que la iglesia, a través de esta labor pastoral, esta labor social, desempeña un rol muy importante en la defensa de los derechos humanos, en la reconstrucción del tejido social, y por eso es que tiene que ser incluida incluso en las estrategias que ya sea se diseñen o se ejecuten a nivel local, a nivel estatal, porque ellos no son un actor pasivo, también pueden ser una fuerza activa. Entonces, yo creo que es importante también tener ese enfoque.
Annalie, we'll give you the final word.
I know we're at the end. Just in response to Max's question about international action, one thing, obvious thing, is acknowledging that this happens. It was a step forward a couple of years ago when the US, for example, began to include non-state actors in their reviewing of entities and countries of concern. That said, generally, most of those entities or non-state actors of concern that have been identified are those of religious nature. So ISIS or Boko Haram, and there hasn't really, I don't think, been a lot of examination of these groups that may not, some have a political ideology, but many are purely business-oriented criminal, organized criminal groups. So looking at that more methodically, and then the other thing that I think is really key is where international actors have embassies in like Mexico or Colombia, when they're engaging with religious actors, like Teresa has just mentioned, it's important that they are getting as diverse voices as possible. So I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation that what I described would not be the experience of a middle or upper class pastor or priest maybe living in Bogota or Medellin. The experience they have is very different from someone living out in a rural area. But those people tend to have more access to embassies, more access to the media, and so their voices tend to be louder. So I would also ask those who are researching this, whether it's from a government point of view or the civil society side, to be ensuring they're engaging with a diverse set of voices from different parts of the country, living in different contexts, to make sure they're getting the whole story and not just part of it.
Okay. Father Sotelo, do you have a very brief word before we wrap up?
Sí, sí, sí. Solo un minutito rápido. Creo que la iglesia en México es una iglesia que sí ha trabajado muchísimo, 7 por 24. Y puedo decir, porque muchos no creían, al sacerdote mexicano lo matan o lo han asesinado por ser sacerdote, por ejercer su función pastoral en este país. Entonces, creo yo que eso es importante también remarcar. Gracias.
Thank you. All right, and with that, we'll conclude our webinar. We want to thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar on transnational organized crime and religious persecution in Latin America. This will be the first of a series of webinars on similar topics around religious freedom in Latin America, and we'll hope you'll be able to join us for future discussions as well. Thank you to our panelists, and we'll be in touch.